right, everybody. Good morning. So, I first want to go over a couple of items here, real quick. So, I'm going to show you some ideas that we have regarding how do we get values in and out of functions. So, we've introduced you to it a little bit already, but just so that we're kind of on the same page here. So, we've done a couple of these things already. We've done print statements. We've done the inputs. We showed you how to do the uppers and different things. So, almost always I'm going to say about 90% of the time we're going to pass our data in those parentheses or the parentheses there. So um, if we do that, they typically call that argument. So if I see open and close parentheses, that almost always tells me that we have a function that we're passing data into, whether it's already created like the print statement or it's one we've defined and we've created a function of some sort. So the advantage is we get to do things over and over and over and over. So here's an example of one that we might use in a program quite a bit. Something like get a name or get input from a user. So instead of having to rewrite this in our main code, we could put it where it's a function. So we know that it's a function because we defined it, but we also know that these pieces are part of that function because they're indented. And so one of the hardest things to do in Python, I think, for most people when they start out, is that this blocking is making sure that your stuff is at the right indentation level so that you get the pieces. So if I indented this print statement to here, then it becomes actually part of this block. So it's kind of a easy thing to screw up, and then it your brain processes and doesn't realize what you've done here. So this function here, again, we're doing a couple of different things with it. We're going to add a function called add number. So inside of that functions, we input a number, input a second number. We have create a third number by turning those into integers and then returning them. So, and we return this number, but notice what happens here. So here's where that abstraction layer is important. Remember, those variables are only available inside this function where they're created. So it says return number 3. So it takes this value and sends it back, but we don't have to necessarily call it the same number. In fact, I'm going to encourage you not to, so that you don't try to just grab that variable directly where it will not do it. So this idea of calling something over and over and over again is a powerful tool. One of the things that our computer does better than we do is things over and over and over again. So maybe we need this add function several different places. So instead of having to write it in our mainline code, now we can put it into a function. All right. So if I have a user-defined function, we'll take in parameters the same way. So I just want to make sure we're kind of clear on that. These are kind of a fun things. Now, here's the one thing that's kind of interesting. So we don't have to pass in just one name or one argument. We can pass in several. So here we've created a form or a formula called format name. So we take name input, age input. So we take two values in. What is your name? What is your age? And those get passed into this particular function. So here's where it does get tricky. If you have a bigger function, so maybe you're passing in 5 or 6 variables and you don't match them, you can run into some issues. So we'll practice with those and you'll see some of the things we're going to do with them. But these functions are really a great way to reuse code. This is the only class I tell you copy and paste is a good thing, but we're going to look at functions and look at things that are going on there. So modules, jump back All right. So make sure you've read functions, passing values, you've looked at the PowerPoint, and we're going to actually look at module 2.1 first. So open that one up. Now, I have to go in and pull out any reference to a video, and I have not had a chance to do that because the original source I stole heavily from Microsoft, and they no longer have some of those available. So we'll just create our own, and life will be good. So, all right. So we're going to create a couple of things here. So I'm going to start idle, and I am going to tuck it. Wherever it's going to go here. I'm going to put it on half of my screen, and then I'm going to tuck this on the other half, and then we can see where we're at. File new. So I'm going to create a new file, of course. And first thing I'm going to do is put in some comments so that I know where I'm at. So U1, M2, A1, just so we're all on the same format. And then I've got this big enough, it may cause a little bit of an issue for us, but I will see what we can do to alleviate that. All right, so functions, and one of the things as you start to do anything I can just call as a, hey, I needed to go do this, so I need to go get a name or something, I think of as those would be great for a function. So it makes my mainline code a lot easier to see because I don't have all these functions and all these pieces just streaming in there. I can see the main section. And we do it all the time with our own lives and different pieces. We don't think in our brain, oh man, I need to go to the library and pay a fine and get a book. You go, I'm going to go to the library. And that's essentially a function. So here's what we're going to look at. So functions are code tasks. Here's some examples. So number 7 says, write the code to display a message that uses 8 or more arguments in the print function. You must use at least 3 variable names. Name the variables correctly and remember the spacing between words. Oof. Okay, so a couple of pieces in here. So you're going to write the code to display a message that uses 8 or more arguments in the print function. Okay. Okay. So when I say that, what I'm really saying is inside of that print statement, everything inside of here is an argument. So before I do my print statement, I'm going to define a couple variables. So I'm going to create one called name. I'm going to say that's equal to and is equal to candlestick. Room is equal to, can't tell I was in a murder mystery this weekend. All right. And so now I have at least 3 variables. Could I put more in there? So we're going to put all these items in there, but we know we need at least 8. So the mystery this weekend, comma, and then I'm going to add in either so I could do it this way, and I could say, all right, was, so there we're creating separate different arguments in there. Was In other words, I'm just putting 8 different arguments in there. I don't think I have quite 8, but so now I'm pulling those out, and I didn't pull all those pieces out because it's a little hard to see on here since that screen's so small on here. But that's number 7. So it just takes a little bit of putting pieces together to do that. Well, again, I want to look at this idea of functions. So I'm going to move on down to number 8. So once you create that, now you can see, all right, that looked, well, our print was okay, but the way it looked was kind of ugly. So I'm actually going to do this just so I can make things easier to see. All right, so number 8, when we get down here, so we start talking about code and using a definition, our indents. Now, here's where I'm going to tell you to be a little careful. If you are using depending on what text tool you're using, 4 spaces is not always accurate if it's one that does proportioning. So if you were trying to use Word, for example, that's not necessarily accurate. So I prefer to just use the tab key as my indentation, and almost all tools that allow you to write for Python will actually work on those kinds of things. So let's look at a forma or the formulas again. So um, it can have parameters. We may be able to create a function that doesn't take anything in; it just does something, and it may or may not return something. So they have some examples here. A function named say hi to display a string, 3 to display an integer here, so it does different pieces. Well, we want to create a function here called shout it. So first thing we're going to do is define, and notice it turns a different color depending on which tool you're using. And we're going to call it shout it. All right. And this function should display a phrase in all caps with an exclamation mark concatenated at the end. So anytime I use the word concatenated or hear it, that means we're using the plus symbol. Initialize a variable my phrase and assign it a short phrase of your choice. Okay. So define shout out. Okay, we can do that. So this function is going to display what we have in my phrase. And so I'm just going to put my phrase right up in the function is equal to more cheese, please. So now we have a function setting in here we're starting to create. Well, our next step would be then to print that out of this function. And so we're going to print my phrase. If I spell it correctly. My phrase. Now, if I just use the plus symbol and I put in my exclamation mark, that should put it right at the end of the phrase. So we can try this then and see if it will run. So since we're not passing anything into this, all we have to do to call this function then is just say shout, and that should call our function, right? So we can call our function very, very easily then. So that would be essentially what we're looking at for number 8. Now, make sure you test these out just for quick expediency so we can get through some of this. I'm going to kind of go jump pretty quickly here. So 9 says view the video that doesn't exist that I got to remove. And then the other way we can do things is we can pass variables into or out of our function. So I'm going to skip down a little bit, and I'm going to go all the way down here to number 10. So write the code to define and call a function using variables as the argument. define a function called scream this. Okay, easily done. So I'm on number 10. So define, and so now we can just call it scream this. Now, get user input. So define and call a function using a variable as the argument. Okay, so inside of this one, it says we're going to pass in some kind of thing in here. All right, and so I'm just going to call it word for now so that I know something in here. And we're going to print get user input, call the function, blah, blah, blah. Display output in all caps. So we've learned how to do that. So word.upper, right? So, and then we can concatenate in something like this. All right, so now we have to go back to our main line, and you're gonna create a variable here, and you're gonna use an input. So let's call that words equals input a phrase. All right. Now, luckily, we know that anything you do is going to be a variable because anytime we do an input, it's a variable. So now we just have to pass that in to our function. Scream this, words. All right. So our function, as we run it, so remember these are up in our header. So we're going to have, it's going to say words equal, and it's going to run our input. And then it's going to call our function, pass this in. But notice that it's words here, word here. And that's okay because what we're doing is something called passing by value. So in other words, we're not passing in the entire uh, variable. We're only passing what's inside the variable into this. We could literally call these X and Y or all different kinds of things. All right. So this one should be pretty easy to crunch through the pieces on that. Come back here. Okay. So 2.1 should be fairly easy to work with. Um, Unit 1, Module 2, Test, Functions, Quiz. I think we'll get rid of this one just because that seems duplicated. So we will just actually delete something there to make life a little easier. So what I'd like to also do is introduce you to something a little interesting. So I have a video from last year. Um, so I encourage you to go look at it. But we're going to actually do that live real quick. So chat GPT. So typically you have to have an account, and maybe I can remember my login. Oh, it logged in for me. Great. Okay. So one of the really great things about ChatGPT, and this is 3.5. I have access to 4, but I don't usually typically go there. So um, this is the one most students are going to have. Most people that are just wandering from a company, they're going to start with this. So there's a lot of interesting pieces in here that I think are kind of interesting. So create a Python code for a function to get a user's name. Oh, so I think in the future, as these tools get more and more advanced, a lot of the things we're going to be doing is trying to parse into even more natural English language and utilizing it to create these parameters and these functions. Now, does this necessarily meet all of our requirements? Probably not, and you'd want to put some other. So you could do something very similar. So you could say, create a Python code using variables, including and you could create a whole, but at that point you're actually creating more work than creating this code. But what I think is useful is, oh, I can structure this and I can see how they did this. So now I want to create one, and I can take a look at this as an example. So now I can say, okay, so define username, because we know my instructor likes camel casing. So you can get a lot of those pieces in here, and you go, oh, well, okay, name equals input. So you can do a lot of those different pieces, and then in this case it returns a name back, shows you how to use it. Well, you can actually create much more sophisticated pieces than that. Now let's do this. So, a little more sophisticated using a different language, but hopefully you get the idea there. So tools we could use for things like web scraping, so we can come in and grab stuff off of a website and then modify it and return it. So ChatGPT, I think, is going to change a lot of our ideas about what we want to use programming for, how we use it, and it's kind of handy because if I want to create, see if it'll yell at me here. It might. Now, so they have built in some kind of ethical pieces. See if it'll allow it. So sometimes it doesn't do what we want it to do. Hmm. Okay. But other times it can do some really interesting things. So I just want to make you aware of that. Is it a resource out there for a lot of items? Yes. A couple of things you have to be aware of. Not every piece of code that ChatGPT will create or any other of the large language models will actually run. So I've tried and played around with it and gotten some that doesn't run. I'm like, oh, okay. So it will lie to you. It is programmed to deliver an output, whether it's correct or not. Uh, some legal firms have gotten in trouble already because they tried to do some of the work using ChatGPT, which I think in the future will do a lot of it. But what they were doing was it was creating make-believe court cases and referencing them. So there's other things though that are pretty interesting. So um, here's one we did just to see if we could do it, um, where we looked at how to track frequencies of outcomes of rolling dice. So here we roll 2 dice, we total them, and then as we run this, is this the one that ran? I'm trying to remember. So just pop this in here real quick. So as we run this, in this case, this one ran 50 times, and it gave us our frequencies of how many times we got these particular numbers. So in this case, when we ran it, we only had a couple that were 1 plus 1, obviously, and only a couple that were 6 plus 6. And that's kind of what we would think is we're going to get far more in the middle where there's more possible permutations or commutations of that. So is it a great way to find some quick data and do some things? Yeah. Yeah. Is it really what you want to use to do your homework? No. But can it be used as a resource? Yes. So I always want to point that out because uh, we have some students who think that ChatGPT is the only way they can do anything, including papers and such. And we're starting to figure out some models, and we see what it says. The other one, I don't think any of mine actually popped it up. Um, Sometimes they will actually pop up, and in the middle of the comments, it will say something about I am a. Um, it will pop up things about I am an artificial intelligence bot, chat, and if you don't even read through it, you didn't really use it to gain interesting information. All right. I do have a couple of other videos. So ChatGPT. So I will leave this one up from last year where I went into a little more depth with it. Make sure you've done all these, and then we'll take a look at a separate video on activity 2.2.